Thank you, Edward. Thank you all for being here. Drizzle never kept people in Seattle away. And there are a lot of friends here, a lot of supporters, people we've worked with over the years. But this is a different kind of presentation. I'm not going to go into a huge rendition of all the things that are wrong with this world of ours, because I'm going to be animated by two little statements of ancient vintage. One was from Marcus Cicero, over 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome, when he defined freedom as participation in power. Notice he didn't just define freedom as from repression and harassment and all kinds of bad things of arbitrary power. He defined it positively as well. Freedom is participation in power. And the second insight came from 14th century China under the Ming Dynasty, when one of their famous philosophers said, "To know and not to do is not to know. To know and not to do is not to know." That is particularly appropriate for millions of Americans who see things that are not right, who see the drift of our country here and abroad heading toward serious complications and tragedies for our descendants, if not for ourselves, and who display great concern. But that concern is often not translated into action. And in this context, civic engagement. That's the difference between someone who is just concerned, but someone who believes that to know and not to do is not to know. Now, I'm going to just start with three little stories, because before we get civic engagement, we have to have a civic personality. You can't just say something is terribly wrong and you go into temper tantrums because you're so worried about it. You lose your studiousness, you lose your temperamental equanimity, and you lose a lot of the assets that you would have otherwise. So, three quick stories. Isaac Newton, way back when in England, the famous physicist, was at a gathering. And someone came up to him and said, "Mr. Newton, why are you so much more brilliant than the other scientists?" And he looked at the person and he said, "I'm not so much more brilliant than the other scientists, but perhaps I can hold on to a problem in my mind and concentrate on it longer than most of them." Pull out the word concentration. Concentration. Now we move to William Blake, who is a famous artist and poet in England over a couple centuries ago. And he was at some get-together, and someone came up to him and said, "Mr. Blake, with whom are you living now?" And Blake looked at the person and said, "With whom am I living? I'm living with my imagination." So pull out the word imagination. The third was a statement, very modest, by Albert Einstein, but he was making a point. He said, quote, "I have no special attributes. I have no special assets. I just have a passionate curiosity." And pull out the word curiosity. So we have concentration, imagination, curiosity. We're all able to reflect those traits and put content into them. And that really is sort of the infrastructure that we fill with the facts, the data, the statistics, the trends, the tragic results, or the beneficial results. And before I lose a reference to history, let me just share with you a story about Eugene Debs, the great leader of working people from about 1890 to 1925 in America. And he was the kind of person, he took a train from Philadelphia to speak to an audience in the open fields in Chicago, and 150,000 people showed up. So he's pretty well known. He was opposed to World War I, and Woodrow Wilson had his Attorney General prosecute him and throw him in jail. And in jail in 1920, he got 1 million votes for president. He ran for president several times. I can share his experience. The, the interesting tidbit here is that near the end of his career, which was about 1925, he was really pretty exhausted. He was asked by a reporter, Mr. Debs, what's your greatest regret? You've been fighting for the working person all these decades. What's your greatest regret? And he said, my greatest regret? He said, my greatest regret is that the American people, under their Constitution, can have almost anything they want, but it just seems that like they don't want much of anything at all. That goes to the expectation level. The grimmest and most effective controlling process by the few over the many is not outright brutality. It's lowering or keeping expectation levels so minimal that the very imagination or the very view that things could be different doesn't cross their mind. That was the status, say, of slavery, or the status of the serf in the medieval periods. So with that background, let's start with what there is a major public opinion behind in this country. And a lot of these are left-right support. One of the biggest divide and rule tactics that's going on in this country is that constant drumbeat every day. We are a highly polarized society. We are blue state, we are red state, we are conservative, we are liberal, and we just can't get together. That may be true in reproductive rights, school prayer, gun control, and some other issues. But there are a huge number of transformational issues that there is heavy left-right support behind. Right here in Washington State, you're going to have an initiative to take the minimum wage to $13.50 outside of Seattle, where it's going to 15. There is heavy left-right support. In fact, there's almost no overt opposition to this on the television, I'm told, and it's going to win with a super majority. Throughout the country, it comes in the polls 75 to 80% in terms of a significant restoration of the minimum wage adjusted for inflation, which would be $11, plus additional increase to reflect a tiny bit of the worker productivity increase since 1968. But there's more. There's left-right support to preserve and defend our civil liberties even when we're attacked, like 9/11. Not to give up our liberty for security. As Benjamin Franklin once said, those who prefer security over liberty deserve neither. And there's strong left-right support against those provisions in the Patriot Act that allow the government to search your home and not tell you for 72 hours, to get into your medical, financial, library records without probable cause, which is the key in the Fourth Amendment. And there's very strong support for that. The bloated military budget, you wouldn't think so, but you go to the various concentrations of opinion on this. And while conservatives may like a bigger budget than some progressives, none of them like the bloated, inflated, corrupt, redundant military budget that isn't even auditable. It's the only department in the United States government that cannot produce data to the Government Accountability Office of the U.S. Congress to get audited. And it's violating federal law since 1992. You'll get a good left-right. That was illustrated by Congressman Ron Paul and Congressman Barney Frank, right-left in Congress. They developed a caucus to reduce the bloat in the military budget. There are others as well. Cracking down on corporate crime. There's all kinds of corporate crime against consumers, against homeowners. Remember the robo signatures and the whole mess with the derivatives and phony mortgages and overextension of credit, etc., and foreclosures. There's corporate crime against workers, occupational disease hazards, not paying overtime, so forth. There's corporate crime against the environment. We know that in many ways. These are all reported. The interesting thing here is that there's so little done about corporate crime that even major media that rely on corporate advertising think nothing of reporting it because they know that nothing's done about it anyway. So why would the advertisers be that upset? And you see it with the Wells Fargo situation. And you see it with insurance scams. You see it now with scamming, where their computerized systems allow sellers to sell you things you never knew about, you never wanted, but they appeared on the bill. And if you started messing around and complaining, they say, well, watch out for your credit score, your credit rating. There's corporate crime against the government. $60 billion is the estimate looted from Medicare by the vendors around the country. $60 billion, and they recover about $5 billion a year because the same lobbyists make sure that the enforcement budgets against corporate crime are minuscule. There aren't enough federal cops on the corporate crime beat. And then there's the criminogenic crimes. These are technically not crimes because the corporations excluded this kind of behavior when Congress was contemplating statutory law. So they are not technically crimes, but they fit the common law of a crime. Premeditated behavior resulting in the loss of innocent life or the loss of property, and somehow it never was protected by a criminal statute. But what do you call, for example, what's going on now in military policy and foreign policy, where you have private contractors shooting up people, doing things that only the military was supposed to do, encroaching on public functions such as military activity, and increasingly doing more and more of what corporations were never permitted to do, and doing it under a kind of protective immunity because they're under sort of Department of Defense contracts. And you've read stories about what's happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the like. I graduated from Harvard Law School, and I just wrote a column recently, and I said Harvard Law School should split its curriculum into two. One is Harvard Law School, and they study statutes, judicial decisions, they tweak them here and there, and have good discussions with their professors. And the other curriculum is Harvard Lawless School. The massive lawlessness in the plutocracy and the oligarchy is institutionalized. The presidency now, regardless of who's there, is above the law in very, very major respects. Right now, it is presidential doctrine that a president can kill anybody in the world who the president thinks is a suspect, never mind imminent danger, just as a suspect, doesn't like us, would like us to get out of their backyard, and become, as president, in secret, vaporizing them with drones, push button Nevada and Virginia, become the executioner, become the prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner, all in secret. And they can vaporize 7 or 8 young men in Yemen standing there. They don't even know their names. But the algorithmic models say, these fit the age group and their gestures and so on, push the button, and they're gone. This is organized murder. Now, all wars are murder, but they're supposed to be legal under international law. If you're attacked, you can fight back, and a lot of people die. But this is now completely out of control, and it's bipartisan. And it's partly out of control because Congress has surrendered its constitutional duty to declare war, and if it doesn't, the presidency cannot go to war, cannot engage in military attacks, unless there's imminent threat. And imminent threat is not defined very rigorously these days. It almost is defined by oratory that's hostile to the United States. So there is a lot of left-right support. Criminal justice reform. 15 legislatures have passed juvenile justice reform because liberals, conservative lawmakers got together. Solar energy, big left-right support. If they had to choose with solar energy or fossil fuel, nuclear, hands down, it's solar. It doesn't matter whether it's it doesn't matter if it's liberal or conservative. The Koch brothers are putting money in state legislatures in the South to get a sales tax on solar panels. Guess what? They're losing, because there's no such thing as a Republican solar panel or a Democrat solar panel. And this includes wind power, of course, and the various forms of renewable energy, the forthcoming geothermal and the like. Another one is standing to sue. There's a doctrine that says you as a citizen cannot sue the government for raw corruption, for misuse of resources, for any kind of egregious effort, because you're considered not having enough of a stake to persist the lawsuit. That's coming out of medieval England, completely antiquated, but it's become a doctrine of judicial abdication and convenience, so that you can't even get through the door and plead in court with the evidence. You can't even get through the door. No standing to sue. That comes in over 90% when you explain it. Binding none of the above, so people can go and vote no confidence for those on the ballot. That comes in off the charts, left, right. That way, binding none of the above gets more votes than the other candidates on the ballot. It cancels that line, and you have new elections in, say, 30 days with new candidates. It's a way of registering no confidence in gerrymandered or other kinds of corrupt electoral practices. Breaking up the big New York banks that are too big to fail. George Will, conservative columnist, writes several times, if these banks are too big to fail, they are too big to exist. Again, left-right support. In my book, Unstoppable, it's over there, The Emerging Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State, there are 24 areas of convergence. And the importance here is not only it fights the divide and rule strategies that are often unscrupulously manipulative, but it produces a political movement that is unstoppable. I have seen members of the Senate and House receive delegations of left-right, like to stop the breeder reactor program in 1983 in Tennessee. And when they see that delegation in the office is composed of liberals and conservatives, they turn pale. They don't know how to game it. They don't know how to manipulate it. So if we really want to get things done in this country, let's pick some of those major issues, and these are major issues, getting rid of crony capitalism or corporate welfare, left-right support. These are not minor issues. Then we can get things really done and overcome this, que sera, whatever will be, nothing can change, oh me, oh my. Let's go look at the third rerun of Friends on TV or something. So the list goes on, but I hope I have made my point to get to my next point. Now, when you look at all these changes that need to be made, and this country is full of problems it doesn't deserve and full of solutions it doesn't apply that are on this shelf. Housing, public transit, energy, new kinds of tax codes, new kinds of financing for small business, etc. That when you ask, well, how do we get these? What's the one institution that we have to have a laser beam focus on to get it done? Because, you know, you've been parts of these rallies here in Seattle, anti-war rallies or climate change rallies or whatever. And we've all participated in these rallies. They're usually on weekends. They usually are very effervescent, and they charge people up. And Monday morning, there's cleanup, and all that energy goes into the ether because it is not laser beam focused on what? The most powerful institution of Congress is Congress. 535 people. We know their names. It's not a faceless bureaucracy in the executive branch. We know their names. They want our vote. They don't want a primary challenge. They don't want strong citizen organization back in the district that nullifies no matter how much money they raise. Because money is not votes. Money is to get votes by TV advertisements and slogans and all the things that cater to a small number of voters whose minds are not made up. And 80% of the voters in this country are hereditary voters. They vote Republican or Democrat because their grandparents voted Republican, Democrat. And so that 20% is targeted on these ads relentlessly again and again. And if people do not do their homework, they're very vulnerable to the various emotional and often grotesquely distorted appeals regarding who's running against whom. The interesting thing, by the way, just as a sidelight, if you want to make sure that you shift the balance of power with your senator and representative so they cannot manipulate you so easily, do not confront them with one issue. If you say to a senator, I'm pro-choice, or you say, I'm pro-life, and you don't say anything else, they know how to deal with you because they've taken the position. What if you come up with 15, 20 issues and you start saying things like, I want the Patriot Act revised. I want Taft-Hartley law repealed. Strict control against forming unions. I want consumer protection in the financial area in a way where I can join with other consumers and tip the balance against some of these banks and even negotiate directly with them. Anyway, you go into it. The more issues you put on the table, the more you control the dynamic and the less they control the dynamic. Just this is a side bit here. So if Congress is the Khyber Pass, you remember the Khyber Pass in history class, when the invaders wanted to go into India centuries and centuries ago, like from the Mongols or other invaders wanted to go to India. They didn't go over the Himalaya mountains, did they? I mean, you think they were dumb enough to do that? They went to the Khyber Pass. That was the entry. Congress is the Khyber Pass, where millions of people, as Warren Buffett said, how come we can't control 535 people? Because we haven't organized minimally to do so. And what's important about that is here's how minimal it is. Now, we all have hobbies, most of us, and there are all kinds of hobbies. Stamp collecting, some people collect cars, that's fairly expensive. Coin collecting, they collect feathers, they collect dolls from Sicily, they collect all kinds of things. Or, bird watchers. I'm in total awe of bird watchers, by the way. The diligence. Up at 5 in the marshes, binoculars, camera, points, tablets, connect with everybody else. I'm up to 24. I got 38. Got to get up earlier. The energy's awesome. I'm told there are 5 million serious bird watchers in the United States. I don't count 100 serious Congress watchers. I count political clubs, they're trying to get elected. But citizen watchers to try to get the general interest going, full-time, paid. There isn't 100 of them. That's shocking. Because if you come to think of it, what's at stake in terms of transforming this country and helping to transform the world by getting off their back or helping them by becoming a humanitarian power, perhaps, not just military superpower, is a huge challenge for our generation and our loyalty to posterity. It's going to be hard to look at our grandchildren in the eye. When they're sitting on our lap and they're 9 years old, they're becoming aware of what's happening to the world. And the climate change is hit. And the dispersal of dangerous weaponry is hitting. And the global economy is on the precipice. And the speculative binges of other people's money, like mutual funds and pension funds. That's the Wall Street practice. And this 9-year-old, has some sort of sense that things are going really bad, fast. And looks at you and says, Grandma, Grandpa, what's going on? What were you all doing when this started? What is Grandma and Grandpa going to say? Well, little child, we were otherwise busy. Otherwise busy? What were you otherwise busy with when it comes to your civic duties? That child is going to be saying when it grows up. So let's look at it very practically. Never has there been more than 1% of the people engaged throughout American history, spread out among congressional districts. Never has been 1%, often much less than 1%, wanting a change opposed by powerful interests, but wanting a change that reflects what Abraham Lincoln called the public sentiment, namely public opinion. And the powerful interests lost. Corporate and commercial interests were against the abolition of slavery. Think cotton plantations. They said no. They were against women's right to vote. Women wanted to get rid of child labor in dungeon factories, among other things. They said no. They were against the farmers organizing in East Texas in 1886 for the great spread of the progressive movement, to regulate bank interest rates and regulate railroad freight rates that were squeezing their livelihoods. The banks and the railroads said no. They were against the right of workers in the industrial areas to organize unions. And the corporations said no. They were against proposals for Social Security, Medicare, auto safety, environmental health. They said no. They were against regulating the deadly coal mines, which have taken over 450,000 lives since 1890, disease and accidents, so-called. They said no. They said no to the abolition of child labor. Imagine that. They said no to progressive taxation, to the 40-hour week, to unemployment compensation. They said no. But they lost eventually because a handful of people here, there, and everywhere zeroed in on Congress or their state legislatures representing majority opinion and broke their opposition. Now I submit we don't have to wait that long anymore. We have faster communications, we have cheap communications, and other advantages that our forebears didn't have. When those farmers organized in the populist movement in 1886 in East Texas, they signed up 200,000 farmers in 6 months, $1 dues each. That's $50 today. Dirt poor farmers, that was a lot of money. And they did it without motor vehicles, telephone, no email, no text message, nothing but their head, heart, and feet. They shame us. We should be ashamed collectively, even though we may exempt ourselves because we're more active. Collectively, we should be ashamed. We're always preoccupied, aren't we? When you call someone to come out for a march or a town meeting or a courtroom where an issue's being adjudicated, and you call them to come out, you're not changing their mind. They agree with you on the issue. And they say, I'm sorry, I don't have time. Or they tell you, well, I may have time, but I don't want to get into this thing. I don't know Robert's rules, and they tell me to shut up, and sometimes they throw you out of the town meeting. And also, I don't like bad language being used against me. I don't like to be slandered. And by the way, if I had the time and I knew the techniques and the tools of getting democracy underway, and I was not blistered by moonbeams, it wouldn't change anything anyway. That's the ultimate cop-out. The big boys are going to do it anyway. Boeing is going to exempt itself from Washington state taxation anyway. Paul Allen's going to make you pay for a stadium anyway. So why try? Why lose time? You got better things to do. Well, let's put down the figures. There are 2.5 million adults. There are 225 million adults in this country. Now you take not 10% of them, not 1% of them, just take 2,500 of them in each congressional district. No big deal. They could represent teachers, mechanics, neighborhood organizers, lawyers, business people, nice spread. 2,500 decide they are going to have a Congress Watchdog Club. And it's going to revolve around an agenda of 12 transformational changes that reflect majority opinion, as I gave some examples. Long overdue. Some of them have been established in Western Europe for over 50 years. Over 50 years ago in Western Europe, tuition-free higher education for all. A higher minimum wage for all. Easier rules to form stronger labor unions than we have for all. Better public transit. Better public works. 4 to 7 weeks paid vacation. Paid maternity leave. Paid child care. Paid family sick leave. Full insurance. Nobody dies in Western Europe because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. 35,000 Americans die every year because they can't afford health insurance, or they're pushed out of it with all these little trap doors to get treated in time. That's coming off a Harvard Medical School peer-reviewed study that had it at 45,000 before Obamacare. What did they know we didn't know? They were destroyed after World War II. We were king. Number one power. What they knew was that they had multiple party systems, not a two-party duopoly. They had powerful cooperatives. They had powerful trade unions. They resurrected them after World War II. And they had higher expectation levels. They believed they should get something for their taxes, other than military hardware, other than corporate welfare. We don't believe that. We want lower taxes instead of saying, what are we getting for our taxes? Half of the federal government's operating budget, just think of this, there's no more Soviet Union. Half of the federal government operating budget is military. That doesn't even count the VA. So here we are. You get 2,500 people. You can start with 100. Letterhead, you give, 5th District, Washington State, Congress Watchdog Group, and you send a letter announcing your existence to your 2 senators and representatives. And you say, stay tuned. We're going to get bigger. And just as you can do your homework ahead of time, here's the 12 Transformational Agenda. We want you to pass. Enough is enough. You've been delaying. You're gridlocked. You worked 125 days a year. We pay you full time. You spend an average of 20 hours a week going from your office on Capitol Hill to an office building to raise funds because it's illegal to dial in your office. You should be on the job. They get this letter, and what's going on here? There's a bit of sophistication. And you tell them we got law professors and lawyers, we got community colleges and colleges, we got a lot of brain trust here. We'll be sending you the draft legislation in due time. Then you go to 500. You get a little press. You got an email. You got a blog. You go to 1,000. You go to 2,500, and this is what triggers. What triggers is that you all agree to volunteer about 200 to 300 hours a year each behind this effort, and to raise $200 to $300 each to open 2 offices in every congressional district, 2 full-time people. And then you connect with it all over the country, 435 districts. Now, I'm leaving out a lot of mechanics here because we don't have the time. But is that undoable, for heaven's sake? There are people who spend more money and more time on their hobbies, and we can't spend that kind of effort on the great work of humanity on earth, which is the pursuit of justice, without which there's no freedom and no liberty. For our posterity, if not for us, for the future of this tortured planet, and the people who are so much less able to live the good life than we are, all over the world, and the children that are in their midst, horrifically mistreated and deprived. Another way to do it is say, isn't there some mega billionaire here in Washington State who's bored? Huh? They're in their 70s, 80s. I mean, how many five-star restaurant meals can you have? With a little bib, you know, and the lobsters. And you got grandchildren, maybe great-grandchildren. You want to have some fun? The joy of justice, nothing can match it. All right, so or if you want to take a piece of it, how about this? The defense budget, as I mentioned, is unauditable. For $2 million, I can guarantee in 36 months, that budget would be auditable. Anybody want to raise $2 million, hire a certain number of people with a strategy, people who know public relations, people who go up on Capitol Hill. There's nobody opposed to it openly. The Secretary of Defenses are not opposed to it. Nobody in Congress is opposed to it. How do you oppose auditing a budget that size, right? So you start out with a big advantage, don't you? The people who don't want it are Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, because they like it the way it is now. I mean, after all, $9 billion was lost in the first year in Iraq by the Pentagon. They couldn't account for it. And the Air Force keeps buying supplies that they have in warehouses around the world that they haven't audited. But even these defense companies are not willing to come out openly and say Defense Department budget should not be audited. It's violating federal law, among other things. Well, that's just one example. One example. That's why this book is called It's Easier Than We Think. That's the title, Breaking Through Power. It's easier than we think. History shows it. Contemporary people show it. I have people in Washington, many of them worked with me. We started them with their own groups. I don't believe in a big bureaucracy. Look what they've done. Dr. Sidney Wolf starts with me, the health research group, gets on the Donahue show. He just came out of the National Institutes of Health at that time, and he and his 8 staff have removed from your marketplace hundreds of over-the-counter and prescription drugs that were killing people or cheating people because they weren't effective for the purposes for which they're advertised. One person, few people in his office. Lois Gibbs comes out of Love Canal decades ago. She was a housewife. She was mother of 3. It was a housing project. They didn't tell them it was over a deadly toxic waste reservoir. Compliments of the departing Hooker Chemical Company, among others. And she raised hell. And she became the leading grassroots organizer with thousands of little groups all over the country operating out of a Washington suburb with $1 million budget to stop in their tracks toxic leaks and other things that were getting families sick. One woman, Ralph Hotchkiss, came out of Oberlin, engineering student. I was in Oberlin speaking one spring, and I heard a wheelchair coming after me as I was walking out the door. And I turned, and he said, "Hello, I'm Ralph Hotchkiss." He's a paraplegic and a bicycle accident when he was in high school in Rockford, Illinois. And he said, "Can I go work with you this summer?" I said, sure. What do you want to do? He says, well, I'm a kind of inventor, and wheelchairs are terribly poorly constructed. They break down. They're not only expensive, but they're controlled by a monopoly company in England, the Jennings Corporation. And I want to break it up. And I want to not patent my inventions. I want to give it free to the VA or anyone else. Goes to Sacramento, San Francisco State. They have a workshop for him. Make a long story short, he revolutionized wheelchair design. He went all over the third world as a paraplegic, teaching poor people how to build sturdy wheelchairs inexpensively from local materials, and they began teaching him different improvements, for which he was very open. And you know, in the third world especially, if you don't have a wheelchair, it's a death sentence for many people. And here he is. Anybody know him? You ever see it on TV? We own the public airways. Why don't we have our own audience network? Why do we give 24 hours a day to the radio and TV stations who pay us no rent, compliments of a supine Congress and FCC, when we should have our own studios all over, reporters, producers. You can't have a democracy without a democratic media. And you can. And how do we pay for it? Simple. We charge the radio and TV stations rent. We're the landlords. They're the tenants. Look at cable TV, 650 cable stations, one more idiotically trivial after another. We do not have a labor cable channel. We do not have a student cable channel. We don't have a patient cable channel. We don't have a small taxpayer cable channel. We don't have anything. And yet we give a monopoly license. Where's our expectation level? Well, to me, the worse things get, the more motivated I get. And that's the. And I stole that value from the sports world. When they're behind, do they give up? Does the basketball team go to the coach in the third quarter? Halfway through, coach, we're 38 points behind. Why waste the rest of the time? Let's call it a day. All right, so we're near the end here. And there's a lot more in this book. This is the shortest book I've ever written. I pay attention to short attention spans. But it's full of real-life examples, real-life necessities, real-life responses. In fact, when you organize this Congress Watchdog group and you summon your senators and representatives to your own town meetings, the formal summons, lawyer-like, whereas Congress is derelict, Congress has surrendered, Congress is this and that. Now, therefore, you are summoned to meet your citizens back home with their agenda, their rules, and their location of public convenience. The summons, you can do your own summons, but I wrote it out for you. You can fill in the blanks. Now, I'd really like you to buy this as a six-pack, because I want you to take it to your neighbors or your friends, or give it to a grown-up child, or whatever. Put it in the library. I'm not bragging about this. There are a lot of good books around, a lot of great documentaries around. We live in a golden age, but very little is happening. These great books that expose terrible situations, read the last 2 pages. They leave you hanging. Until the people rise up. Well, how? Where? Who is going to focus on the Congress or the state legislature? The Khyber Passes. Let me end on this note. There is a grassroots way to start these groups. There is an easy way where some multi-billionaire says, okay, here's $100 million. It costs $100 million to set these up in 435 districts with the organizers, the reach out, and the full-time offices to get it underway, kick-start it. It's so to speak. Either way, you will see such a fast change in Congress that it will dispel all your myths of a gridlocked institution. And I'll end with this note. We proved it ourselves in the 60s and 70s. When I went to Washington, having lost a lot of friends in car crashes, and I was determined to get GM and the auto companies regulated. There were no mandatory safety standards, no seat belts, no airbags, no padded dash panels, no head restraints, no decent brakes, tires, so on. I connected with a few people around the country, including insider engineers in the auto companies, doctors dealing with trauma prevention. And I was there. I remember very clearly my first night was in a YMCA, and I ate my last hot dog at the White Tower. And I said to myself, I was 30 years old, I said, how am I going to go about doing it? First, I went up on Capitol Hill to the jurisdictional committees. In those days, if you got the chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, who happened to be Warren Magnuson from the state of Washington, and who was one of the favorite go-to senators for business interests. Within 5 years, he became the greatest champion of consumer legislation in the Senate in American history, because he was fearing the rumble from the people back here, the rumble from the 60s. And he had some good staff, like Jerry Grinstein and Mike Perchuk. Jerry lives here. I then went to the House, and Congressman Harris from West Virginia. You convince those two in those days, because of seniority, they got it through the committee, you get it through the committee, you get it through the Senate, the Congress. Well, the president has to sign it. You call up, turns out Lyndon Johnson was expected to run for president again, 1968. He had a chief of staff, Joe Califano, who took an interest in auto safety. Had great resonance throughout the country. I mean, who wants to get killed in an otherwise preventable crash? And he said he'd go with it. Then I had to get 5 or 6 reporters, and I knocked on a lot of doors. And I got a reporter for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Morton Mintz, the reporter for UPI, Pat Sloyan, future Pulitzer Prize winner, Baltimore Sun, AP, and believe it or not, the Wall Street Journal. And then it was off. It was done. Now, we're all capable of that. We can do it in your state capital. You can do it in City Hall. Some of you have done it in City Hall. People like Nick Hanauer and others taking the lead on the minimum wage. And when it's done, you say, I didn't think it was that easy. Well, it isn't easy if you just have one person when you need 10, or you have 10 when you need 100. But you almost never need more than that. Less than 1% of the people with public opinion behind them and knowledge and strategy and laser beam focus on the institutions and almost no special interest can stand in the way. Last point. The presidential campaign is nothing more than a mirror of us. We allowed the deterioration every 4 years. We allowed a corporate debate commission to be set up, funded by Anheuser-Busch or Ford Motor Company, controlled by the two parties, and keeping third parties off the stage, the only way they can reach tens of millions of people, even though public opinion polls want more people on that stage, if only to reduce their drowsiness. We're the ones who let the two parties run away from us into the hands of Wall Street and the fat cats. We're the ones who were perfectly willing to be turned into spectators instead of, to use Jefferson's words, participators. We're the ones who were otherwise preoccupied and couldn't give a few hours a year to our citizen and electoral duties. So, we can talk all we want about Donald Trump. These elections were turned into entertainment years ago. Slogans, silly talk, inadequate questioning by the press, all kinds of major issues off the table. I've kept my website open from 2008 just to show you 18 issues that the majority of the people are worried about in this country. Some of them they support, that were taken completely off the table for discussion by the Republican Democratic parties. Go to votenader.org. It's still on. So when I hear a lot of questions about the campaigns, and what do you think of Hillary Clinton? Hawkish Hillary, Hillary of the war, Hillary of the Wall Street, Democratic Party no less. Donald Trump, failed gambling czar, corporate welfare king, cheats almost all his business connections. He cheats his workers, his creditors, his suppliers, his taxpayers. Cheats. He's a cheating Donald. Very unstable. Everything is taken as a bruised ego. Gets up at 3 in the morning to attack the weight level of a former Miss Universe. This is out of Captain Queeg. It's out of Dr. Strangelove, except that he wants to make peace with Russia, and Hillary is waiting to pick a fight with Russia on their western border, which has been invaded twice and killed 45 million Russians. And we're pushing NATO, a military alliance we control, into their western border and wondering why Putin is upset, and he wants to use it to suppress dissidents in his country. This is a very dangerous situation. And she's the leader of the pivot to Asia, which is a way of confronting China. Imagine China having a pivot to the Caribbean, confronting China and ensuring another massive arms race, another bloated military budget, another no money to repair our schools and public transit and libraries and clinics and sewage and water systems while we blow up the infrastructure of other countries unconstitutionally, illegally, and in violation of international treaties. Send a pledge around to your relatives, workers, neighbors to pledge 300 hours or so to form this Congress watchdog. Make it a model. You're the software capital of North America. You know how to send it all over the world, all over the country. Make it a model, just like $15 minimum wage in Seattle is being used as a model in other cities around the country. Lead the way. Pioneer. Thank you very much.